Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Subsection 1. The spring sunshine slept peacefully on the wide gravelled space in front of Hartley front door, and two collies, who had just been out for a run, slept upon the strip of turf just out of the sunshine, with their long tongues hanging out. Easter fell late this year, and the trees were, so to speak, just dressed again. The crocuses were out, such at least as had escaped the busy sparrows, and the wallflowers were out, for it was close on Pentecost. To the right and left of the solemn grey house ran the wide belt of woods like outstretched arms, between which looked the stone-framed windows like meditative eyes, right across the flat stretch of meadowland, bisected by the straight drive that led up to the great porch from the double lodge gates half a mile away. The house was of an Elizabethan foundation, though most of the Tudor work had been supplanted by Caroline. Up in the attics were still the criss-cross black beams, the uneven floors, and the low ceilings, but the rest of the place wore the stately air that is characteristic of the century after. The porch would have been pretentious if it had not been so genuine. Stone men looked over the parapet, as if further to guard the solemn emblazoned coat that was already guarded by a couple of ramping beasts. Two long rows of tall windows ran the length of the house, above which peered out the dormer windows of the earlier date. The roofs of stable and laundry showed at one end, and to the north the high gable of the tennis court above the plantations, into which merged the woods. Finally, to the right hand of the house, in a little cleared space, there stood, rather to the west of the west front, the domestic chapel of Hartley, in the midst of a rather sombre-looking small churchyard, decked with cypresses, and behind it the roof of the more recently built chaplain's house. As a whole, it was an exceedingly respectable place, not to be reckoned, of course, among the greater domestic shrines, yet entirely good of its kind. It appeared to be as much part of the landscape as the woods themselves, or as the solemn lines of the downs discernible away to the south. It seemed that the woods clothed the house, rather than that the house was built in the woods. The little river that ran as the boundary of the southeastern gardens on the other side appeared to have been placed there by design, rather than that the gardens had been laid out according to its course. The collies were so deeply asleep that when their mistress came out at last to see where they never moved. She stood in the shadow looking at them an instant with a faint smile on her face. They were splashed in the black mud all along their undersides, now brazenly displayed to the world, and all up their delicate frilled legs. Jack's face was quiet and solemn, as befitted a male. Jill was still panting in her sleep, as was proper to her hysterical femininity. Their entire attitude was one of complete and exhausted abandonment. "Oh, you pigs!" she said suddenly, in quite a low voice. Jack opened an eye as if to reassure her he was still alive, and thumped the end of his tail twice. Jill leapt up and began to cry aloud with delight. "There, that's enough," said the woman. "Come on round to the gardens, and then you shall go to the stables." "Stables! You pigs!" "No, Jill, don't be so silly. Not yet. Afterwards." She moved round to the left, and Jack, with his middle-aged and masculine sedateness, followed her dutifully. Jill, after unfitting her tail from between her hind legs, where she had immediately hidden it upon hearing the fatal place named, consented to come after, but plainly a little nervous in spite of the promise. "Mummy," said a voice suddenly from overhead, "where are you going?" The woman stopped, and her face twinkled with pleasure as she looked up to the end window of the first floor, where the upper half of a boy appeared over the sill, entirely without any clothes on, but brandishing a towel, and with all his hair on end. "To the gardens," she said. "Oh, are the dogs there?" "Yes, they're a perfect disgrace. Where in the world did you find all that mud?" "Oh, I think it was in the Kestern woods. There was a pond there, and there was a water-hen there. And Jill, you see—" "Yes, I quite see, thanks. Well, they can't come into the house until they're clean." "Oh, Mummy." "Yes? It's not their fault, you know. It was mine. You see, I sent in Jack at one end, while Jill went round to the other, and so—" The woman laughed suddenly. "Oh, you child," she said. "Now get changed quick. I shall be in the pavilion if you want me." Mr. Morpeth's coming to lunch. Oh, and is Miss Morpeth? Go along, Jim, and get changed. Just think if she came along and saw you like that. The white apparition vanished. Subsection 2. The gardens on the eastern side of the house gave a very considerable surprise to anyone who called at the house for the first time. The west side, as has been seen, wore an aspect of a certain severity. There were the solemn front, the cypressed churchyard, the flat lawns cut by the straight drive, and not a flower to be seen except beneath the edge of the plantations on either side. But the eastern side was very different. First, there came a wide stone terrace, flagged underfoot, bounded by a low wall along which stood great stone flower-pots. This was approached from the house, so great was the fall of the ground, by a double flight of stairs leading down in a curve from the door of the hall which ran the whole depth of the building. Beneath the terrace ran a wide gravel path from end to end of the house, and beyond that again a vast lawn, here broken by a circle of flower beds, here by a couple of cedars, here again unbroken and as soft as velvet. Then again, further out, came a gravel walk, and again a low wall, and then the river. This river, perhaps 20 feet across, ran swiftly from north to south, as clear as crystal in its chalk bed. 2 or 3 steps in the wall, straight opposite the hall door, led down to it, and a punt usually rested here. 40 yards further along, a stone pavilion was built out half over the river, perched in the wall, and was entered by half a dozen steps leading up from the gravel walk. To this pavilion, then, across the wide lawn between the cedars and the flower beds, came Mrs. Fanning, as she usually did about the time of the second post. Sometimes she brought her letters with her, sometimes they were taken out to her. If she were not in her own room, it was generally understood that she would be here from about 12 to 1:30. The collies, of course, had made instantly for the Watergate, and were noisily drinking. But even Jack was a little nervous if he were surprised here, for more than once he had been pushed in suddenly from behind by the boy who had conversed out of the window just now. When they had quite done, they proceeded to the pavilion, where the sacred dog's mat lay to the left of the entrance, pushed open the nearly closed door, and resumed their slumbers. The pavilion was an ideal place for a sunny hour in the morning, even in winter. A wide, high window ran in a great semicircle over the river, and was furnished inside with a long, deep window-seat. Until about 4 o'clock in summer, and until sunset in winter, all the sunlight that there was streamed in from the south. The chuckling sound of running water from the current that rushed by beneath was delicious in summer, and not unpleasant in winter. A sensible round table, really firm upon its legs, and furnished with writing materials, stood in the middle of the circular floor. 2 well-filled bookcases hung on either side of the door. 3 or 4 deep basket chairs stood here and there. The ceiling was a plastered dome within, and a cone without, all of solid grey stone. The floor, adequately tiled, was covered with rugs. Anna Fanning had sat down upon the window-seat as soon as she had made sure that the letters were not waiting for her on the table, and was looking out of the window. By turning her head, she could look right up the river for 1/4 of a mile, and down it beyond the stone bridge for about 100 yards. At these 2 extremities the woods came down and hid it. Beyond the woods to the south, however, showed the line of the downs. Even straight out across the river, the view had its charm, for here was the park proper, long rolling grasslands broken by copses, stretching for about 2 miles, and rising gradually towards the foot of the heather hills of Ashdown. Here and there were the cattle, feeding resolutely in the sun, and there, under the shadow of a group of tall trees, she could make out the brown bodies of the deer resting, just outside the bracken, apart and exclusive like the aristocrats that they were. Anna Fanning was just 41 years old, and for the last year she had considered herself middle-aged. She had married, just before she was 30, old Sir Neville's younger brother Robert, and 4 years later Jim had been born. They had lived in town for the most part, coming down here again and again, till, when her husband had died a year after Jim's birth, she had come here altogether 6 years ago to keep house for his brother. Then again, 4 years ago, he too had died, and young Neville had asked her to stay on. She was 41 years old, as has been said, and sometimes she looked a good deal more, and sometimes a good deal less. For first, her hair was quite grey, though as abundant as ever. It had begun to go grey, as was almost the accepted custom in her family, soon after her 25th year, and had continued to do so remorselessly ever since. And there were, of course, lines in her face, though still delicate and slight, especially about her eyes, since she would no more have dreamed of massaging her face than of dyeing her hair. Yet, on the other side, she could still flush like a girl. She still kept her figure, and she still carried herself superbly. She was not in the least pretty, but she was quite beautiful. She had very bright gray eyes. She had finely cut lips that continually smiled a little, but not much. She had a very straight and good profile. Since her husband's death, she had been proposed to at least 4 times, but always by men near 60 than 50, and she had never had even a moment's hesitation in refusing them. It appeared to her that life at Hartley, with a dutiful month or 2 in London, so long as she was allowed to be at Hartley for the rhododendron season, was an entirely ideal life. Of course, it could not continue indefinitely. She had been quite clear to Neville that when he married it must end, and had laughed frankly at his statement that he would probably never marry at all. However, here she lived for the present with Jim, and it was all extremely nice. Jim would go to school next year, to the Benedictines, she thought, and she would continue to keep house even more tranquilly during school-time, unless, indeed, Neville married. Here she had her beautiful house, her stone pavilion to sit in, her horse to ride, her church within a stone's throw, her village to visit in, and just a very few neighbors with whom ordinary courtesies must be exchanged. And then, when Neville married, she would consider the question as to whether she would take the dower house, as he had suggested, at the further end of the park, or take a flat in town, or a little house near Downside, so as to be close to Jim. She rather thought the last plan would be best, but there was no hurry. There never was any hurry with Mrs. Fanning. Things would arrange themselves tranquilly when the time came. Subsection 3. There approached, as she sat regarding the landscape through the big curved window, in that almost motionless attitude that was so completely characteristic of her, the sound of weighty footsteps. Anna turned her head as they came up the stairs, and saw that she had been right, and that it was Masterson himself who was bringing out her letters. This she considered to be very nearly an honor, for there was no one in the whole world, she believed, quite like Masterson. He had taken service under old Sir Neville as his body-servant at least 30 years ago, and, such was his genius, had not only remained in it as butler, but had so impressed himself on the place that Hartley without Masterson simply would not be Hartley. One might as well blow up the porch or the pavilion at once. His tact had been infinite when she had first come here to keep house. He had begged her pardon one morning soon after her official arrival, and had requested to know whether Madame wished or did not wish him to give her some kind of an idea as to how things were done at Hartley. His air of deferential detachment from any personal feeling in the matter had been so superb that the idea of impertinence was simply not to be entertained for an instant. His manner resembled that of one general who had been superseded by another in the conduct of a campaign, but who had vanquished every pulse of resentment. He merely desired to be of service to his successor if it were wished, not unless. Of course, she had thanked him very humbly and gravely. He had proceeded then, still with a magnificent deference, to point out 1 or 2 little matters that were not quite satisfactory, and then, begging pardon again, had departed. He had renewed his instructions later on several occasions, had sketched for her the weaknesses as well as the virtues of Mrs. Canning, the housekeeper, and had suggested 1 or 2 little improvements. Then gradually these instructions had ceased when Anna had been properly formed, and finally he had manifested his entire acceptance of her rule by admitting her to the number of his superiors to whom he permitted himself to be brusque in private. This was the last distinction he could confer. He was never, for instance, brusque to the priest. He had never been brusque to her own husband. He never was brusque to anyone except his obvious superiors, and to them only in the strictest privacy. Well, here he was, coming in at the door, a large figure of a man, grey-haired and rosy, with a fringe of white below his chin, in a swallowtail coat with a V-shaped shirt-front. She wondered why he was here. "The letters, Masterson?" "Yes'm, letter from Sir Neville, 'm." He extended a silver tray to her, and there, on the top, was the envelope addressed in Neville's neat upright hand, with the Italian stamp in the corner. That explained Masterson's ceremonial, then. She took it at once, with a certain eagerness. She had not had a line from him since the note in Easter week, which announced that he wanted to stay a little longer than he had at first intended. It was just like Masterson, she thought, to have scrutinized the letters and to have remarked on it so frankly, but she knew the cause to be sheer loyalty. Masterson retired to the door and stood there waiting. Jack, thinking that something was required of him, thumped his tail again 3 or 4 times, but his friend regarded him severely. It would be entirely as incorrect for him to recognize Jack in public as to allow the familiarities under the same circumstances to Jim, which he would permit in the pantry. Jack ceased and closed his eyes with a sigh. There was a minute of silence in the pavilion after Neville's letter had been opened, broken only by the chuckle of the river beneath the pavilion window. Anna remembered afterwards the significant little silence. Then she looked up sharply. "Yes, Masterson, is there anything?" He raised his eyes for a moment and then dropped them again. No news of when Sir Neville returns, She seemed dazed a little. "No, I don't know. I'll tell you when I've read it. He... She broke off again. Again came the silence, as she turned back once more to the first page. Then Jill sat up and uttered a loud melodious yawn. Masterson still lingered an instant and then turned and went out.